somewhere that led me to a page that was talking about there's a new map for you guys that has taken out all the names of the rivers, mountains, and lakes and replaced them back with the old indigenous people's names.
Oh, okay.
Have you seen it?
No. No,
Right,
not a new one. I mean, I've seen regional maps that have the names and locations of tribes and
no,
things.
I mean, no, this is not like a tribal zone map. This is the names of the geographical places.
Oh, in the original native languages. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, no, they're in English script, like the same as Chappachickwick is, etc.
Right.
So,
yeah. No,
it's there somewhere. It's there somewhere, and I don't know where it's gone.
All right. Yeah, I'd like to see that when you locate it. Hey, Pat.
Hey, Dan.
Should be there. And then, of course, I then also yesterday, I hadn't been paying attention to what was happening in the UK. I wonder why I haven't had an email from Roger recently. Turns out he's in prison.
Who?
He's part of the Extinction Rebellion rebels. And he's one of those people that got nicked for being at the protest. And they finally let them have an email account. So all of a sudden I got one. Yeah, that's what I haven't heard.
Wow.
Yeah, so I've now got it's literally Roger in prison at Gmail at.
Wow.
And I'm thinking, I can't believe that they actually do a Gmail account out of. Yeah, so this is.
Well, I guess you can have a Gmail account wherever you can connect.
Well, yeah, especially seeing that they're relatively easy to look at. So this is via NPR News, which I presume is something local to you. And drop down and hi, back again. And show chat.
Okay, I'm not seeing.
And I meant to get a bit more time and drop it into the.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Obsidian chat, but here's your.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So.
Restore native names to northern Minnesota. So they were all probably Ojibwe names.
Yeah. So are you? I've never bothered to look it up yet. Are you northern Minnesota or southern?
We're northern. Yeah, we're
right.
Okay. We were actually Bemidji is right in between the three biggest reservations in the state. The Red Lake,
I think,
the White Earth, and the Leech Lake reservations. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, you've said about that before, which I sort of half remembered, but haven't bothered to look up with a detailed enough map to actually make sense of that.
Yeah. It was 5 below. It was 5 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit this morning. So a little bit brisk.
Well, I was talking to a Californian, a mid-mountain Californian friend, and they've got snow on the mountains around them, but not down at their level.
Right.
But it was getting close to 0 centigrade. And she's Canadian and he's American, so they talk both languages, as it were. And so he said, so now that you've become desert adapted, what's cold for you? And I said, well, even when I'm sort of halfway up the Alps or whatever in the UK, or swimming across the Gulf of Helsinki in winter, I've always found that when it gets to minus 26 centigrade, it's the time to put the thermal underwear on. And they sort of laughed. So you could hear somebody tapping away. And it's like, minus 14 or something, minus 15 Fahrenheit.
Oh.
And part of what I used to do on a regular basis is test equipment before it leaves the factory. And I had to do an acoustic test or something for Channel 4 television in central London. And it's right, this piece of machine is literally across a very small domestic housing road from some housing. So it had to be quiet. So they said, oh yeah, we could select a very quiet fan and still get the airflow. It's a cooling piece of plant.
Mm-hmm.
So we had to go and test it. And this thing is made on the outskirts of Munich. And we went in January. I said, no, we can't do this. Why not? Because it's 6 inches of snow. It's not a hard surface. Plus, you've rigged up the machine to blow up. On this job, it's going to be turned on its side to blow across. So we did the test anyway, just to see how close they were. The following, during the afternoon, they swept all the snow away. Fortunately, there was no forecast to say that there was going to get any more snow coming. And so they swept all the snow one direction. And because the thing is symmetrical, we just stayed on one side and measured on one side. And then a couple of weeks later, we went back. No snow. The thing stood on its edge. Perfect conditions. And then, of course, we had to wait again till 2 a.m. because that's when the trains stop running. And one side of a factory compound is the train line. All good fun. And no thermal underwear, but it was minus 12 centigrade.
Yeah.
And everybody else was freezing their fingers off. And I'd got mostly my Berghaus kit and similar stuff on for when I did things like, you know, the north side of Jaeger, because the south side of Jaeger is just a bit too much to cope with. It's been near vertical, like a Capitan in down on the.
Yeah. So
and it's also.
Oh, go ahead. How
many responses have we got?
I don't have a I don't have a lot of responses. I just sent out, I got about half a dozen new people came out of the Reddit. And so they're, so I assume, and I had announced that, I don't know, several weeks ago. And I've just put another announcement in, and I asked people to email me.
Yeah, I mean, with his stuff, I could have had about 6 copies of it.
Well,
but you only need one.
Yeah. Well, and part of the delay actually was that, I wanted to give people an opportunity to actually get a copy of the book in a legitimate way, right? Because Scott is actually launching it next Friday at 11 a.m. Pacific time, apparently. So 1 in the afternoon for me, and I assume that means I read his email that he sent out yesterday or whenever it was, and it struck me that he had he's really doing this the old-fashioned kind of self-publishing way, right? Where he found a printer, and he contracted directly with a printer, and he bought a bunch of copies that he's now, he's reselling, and apparently the first printing is pretty well spoken for. So, and I think the issue was he wanted to have color copy. He wanted to have color illustrations in the book, and so that is much more expensive in Amazon. It's not really. He's not really giving he's not really giving away that many, right? He had a bunch of people, and that was part of his concern, I think, also was that he had a bunch of people who have, who have sort of been queued up from when he first started talking a year ago about the book coming out, to buy the book. And so he wanted us to have kind of a head start on reading it based on when I said I wanted to start. But he doesn't want to give away a bunch of books, which I understand, right? He's gone to a lot of trouble.
I've seen quite a few people do on the self-publishing route who have also organised effectively their own sales force, as it were, by saying, "I'll sell you your book at a high discount, and I'll sell you more at 20% that you can then sell on."
Yeah.
And there's one guy whose book I noticed, he's also saying, and if you take 10 or 20 or more or something, he'll give you his first book for free. And this is the second book.
Yeah.
But they're not really related. They're just, although they're on a similar topic, they're not a set or a run on.
Right. He just has an inventory of his first book. So, yeah. So I think, what I've heard from, and I don't have this officially, so maybe I shouldn't be saying it on something I'm going to put on YouTube, but my understanding was it was going to be around $17. And which I think is very reasonable for a book that's printed, that's a quality print job with color illustrations. And that was the thing that, I have looked, because I used Amazon's service when it was still CreateSpace, before it was, Kindle publishing or whatever they're calling it now. And before that, actually, I did write in like 20, I don't even know, it's like 2007 maybe. I wrote and self-published a novel, and that was before CreateSpace, and I actually I don't remember which, I think it was iUniverse or somebody that I used for that. And that one was one where I actually did have to sort of pay up front for them to, to do the print run and all of that. With Amazon, it's not the case. They just, it's a print on demand kind of a thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's a guy here that works in marketing, but he's a published author of primarily spy type novels. He's got like a anti-James Bond character, but he's also done ones out of that grouping, that world, as it were. And he gets around the censorship here by publishing through Amazon.uk, through their printing process. And then he buys 500 copies.
Right.
Ships those over. And of course, you can't buy it in the shops here. The only way is to buy it from him for here. And they're all, half of them are semi-set in the region. He's been in the region a long time, but mostly in Lebanon. But a while back, and he's been here like 10 plus years now. And because it's the Amazon print from in Kindle type thing, the paper's always a bit dodgy, the print's always a bit dodgy, the wrapper, the cover is not, and the binding's not as great as it could be. But it's a book, and it's got an ISBN number, and it's, so you're a published author.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing is I don't mind. I think that the quality that I get, I bought some of the I don't know where they're around here somewhere. I bought some of the latest thing, the note making book, and it was, and it came out of, I don't know, Delaware or Maryland or someplace, where it was printed. They have, and it's as good quality. I mean, ever since, and I think it was probably the Ingram Book Group that first did it in America, that started printing on demand rather than having inventories of, especially, especially books that are not, that aren't new, right? So the, kind of the backlist, that they would just, anything that's perfect bound, is,
I
you know,
mean, I bought, I think his second, third, and fourth book as paper,
mhm.
and they were perfectly serviceable. They were just, it's if you go into a normal bookshop and buy a normal paperback, you go, this feels different. You can it's not necessarily bad, it's just different.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. I think to answer your question, Pat, yes, I do have the Reader app. I haven't used it that much. I got it because I got an email, I don't know, about a month ago, I got an email from Readwise that, my subscription was renewing and did I want to continue it and all that. And I said, yeah, I use it. I emailed them. I said, yeah, I use it every day. I'm on a 650-day streak, and they got really excited about that. And they sent me a hoodie and a t-shirt, and then they invited me to start using the Reader, which, and I had used Instapaper, but I don't really, I'm not really religious about sort of aggregating news, and reading material like that and then kind of processing it. And so I've got the Reader, and it's probably collecting a bunch of stuffs off of different RSS feeds, and it's piling up, I imagine, because with the end of the semester too, I haven't really had a lot of time.
But you still use Zotero as your document manager.
I still use what?
Zotero.
I do still use Zotero as my my bibliography.
So that's now, so that's now in version 6, and it does what the Reader does. So you can mark up PDFs and highlight inside, so you don't need to go and send the highlights to something else, then send it to Obsidian, for instance.
Well, and I don't actually have the whole Zot file thing set up for Obsidian. So so that's not something that I'm using. I do, generally, I store PDF copies of everything. And actually, I've just switched my storage to, my offline storage to this thing, which I love. This is a 2 terabyte Samsung thing in a little rubber sleeve, so that I can drop it, and it's got a USB-C adapter. So I feel better about sort of carrying this around in my pocket or in my backpack than I did about carrying my my Western Digital drives or my Seagate drives around with me. And so I've been, as I've been sort of switching over to this, I've been opening up a bunch of old folders that had PDFs of articles and and out of print books and things off of archive.org, and sort of doing all of the work that I should have been doing in real time of putting them into Zotero and and all that. And the beauty of that is actually the PDFs that I pulled off of JSTOR or wherever had all of the metadata with them. So all I have to do is drag them into Zotero, and it kind of populates all of the fields that I need.
Yeah.
So that's hugely, that's a huge amount of utility.
And of course, Zotero used to get its money from selling above 300 megabytes for your collections, old style. Version 6 with Zot file add-on as well together means that you can point the storage any way you like. So the metadata only goes to the 300 megabytes, which is God knows how many thousand PDFs.
Right.
And of course, PDFs these days, because they're in color as well, are so much bigger. I mean, some of my old science papers are kilobytes, and now, of course, the average size is like 3 megabytes, and it adds up fast.
Right. Right. Yeah. So yeah, I guess I just looked. I hadn't really been paying attention. I guess I've got a 6.0.14 beta on my computer.
And given the internal markup and highlights and quotation grabs and whatever else in the version 6, and to a certain extent with the change of where the file resides, I wondered whether you were going to redo one of your how to take notes things, showing the new version. If you were running the new version, if you're not running the new version yet, then you can't.
I don't think. See, that's not how I use Zotero. I use Zotero mostly as a, and actually, has anybody heard from the Rabbit guys? I have not heard from research or
Research
No.
from Mike and those guys for quite a while.
I just used it a couple of days ago. It worked fine for me.
Okay, so it's
But
still working. Yeah.
Yeah, it's still working.
All right.
It's still working, yeah.
All right.
I
Yeah,
haven't seen any updates.
Yeah, I haven't seen any updates, and I haven't seen any. I haven't seen any email. I haven't gotten any emails. And the last I heard from them, they were thinking about, doing this sort of publishing your collections sort of thing. And they were, their issue. I don't know. I think their issue was a bit about sort of how they were capturing all of this sort of research user information, and it was always that was always interesting, but it was always unclear to me how they were going to monetize that. So maybe that was where they kind of got stuck, was on the other side, on the business plan side. But yeah, I was using this as a kind of, I'm using Zotero as sort of a way to, you got somebody talking behind you, Tim? Maybe I'm just hearing echoes.
No, it's just
No. Coming from somewhere. Sounds like some kind of internet interference.
Maybe, yeah. Oh, so
Crossed wires.
that would be weird. That could be from anywhere. It's kind of funny. I've been on Reddit a little bit, and I've been actually on the there's a new Amazon Prime series called The Peripheral, which is based on a William Gibson science fiction novel. And so I've been sort of on the Reddit page for that, and it's been kind of interesting. It's an interesting, I don't think of Reddit, it's kind of funny. I don't think of Zotero as a note-making system in the same way that I don't kind of think of Reddit as social media. But I guess it is kind of. It's weird. Have you been following the Twitter gate, or the Twitter files, or whatever that Matt Taibbi is publishing?
I had an account, and in like 10 years, I sent like 10 tweets.
Yeah.
If that.
Yeah.
And of course, those tweets that are important that you might not be following in Twitter, but get mentioned in emails, or get mentioned in Facebook, or get mentioned in Reddit, you can still visit that thread without an account. So I just dropped it. And then of course Elon came along.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
It was quite funny.
It's been kind of crazy. I've been, and I've been, like doing my job and, busy with stuff. So I haven't really been following it very closely, trying to sort of figure out, who's for real and who's insane in this, in this whole debate. But it's getting just weird. And the idea that Elon drafted Matt Taibbi to sort of document the Hunter Biden thing, but but he can't write an article on Substack. It has to be an article in a thread on Twitter, is a whole different thing, which I don't know that really lends itself to a nuanced kind of a depiction of what happened. Although I read the whole thing, and I guess, and I don't really like to read threads. I usually, it's sort of usually kind of TLDR for me.
When you mention the kind of the money issue of all of these issues, you start to wonder, especially about Twitter now losing all the advertising dollars, because supposedly that's how it makes money in the first place, was what a lot of people questioned about Musk's investment or purchase, I guess. And and he just does stuff, one would think, that is contrary to any opportunity to make a living on it, to maintain its its infrastructure and personnel.
Well, and I guess that's the thing that I question, is how much infrastructure is there really, and how much of the operating budget is really kind of the bloated headcount.
Where does the money go?
Of of people who sip lattes all day long and don't really do a heck of a lot. So that, it strikes me that it's that as a platform, the technical end of it, the requirements of actually having servers and stuff like that is probably much more is probably a much smaller portion of it. Looks like
I always assumed it was some ongoing maintenance, especially when you use multiple servers. But you look at Mastodon now, where individuals can. I've looked at it, but installing it yourself is doable if you have some tech and you have the right server situation. So that seems to be functional. It doesn't seem to deteriorate or anything. That's what I wondered about Twitter. It's like, well, when it breaks the first time, what's going to happen?
I don't see. I'm not loving Mastodon. I have gotten a bunch of.
You don't like the federated.
I don't like the fact that it never knows who I am, and it always asks me to log in, and then it can't find me.
Yeah.
Then I have to like make a new password, and it's like, well, what is going on? Is there some type of centralized identity validation system? Or if I try to go to, the federated server for history, which somebody, Liz Kovart, just set up, and now there's a new server for PKM. And every time I try to go to one of these new things, it doesn't know who I am. And so I'm thinking, this is more trouble than it's worth.
I don't know. One strategy, I think, is if you locate somebody on a different instance or whatever it's called, you can follow them. But that doesn't work for following any developments on that particular instance.
Yeah, it seems to be kind of. Go ahead, Chris.
That issue you sound like you're having sounds like the kind of fundamental flaws of the federated piece is there's a PKM instance and there's a history instance. There's, I think over 10,000 now.
Yeah.
I heard a number the other day. They don't all know who you are. You log into the PKM instance and it needs an email address and a password specific to that instance. And if you have another account on another instance, a history instance, let's say, that's a different password and a different email. Now, you could use the same email and password on all of them, and that solves a problem. But then if one gets hacked and has issues, they potentially all can be hacked.
Right, which is
So it's not, but it's not distributed in the sense that you have one identity and it knows who you are everywhere. Each instance can figure out who you are based on the thing you have. So right now, I think I have 4 or 5 different accounts on different instances, but they're all separate and none of them know about each other.
Yeah, which doesn't strike me as a viable model, honestly. I mean, because it requires each of these instances to sort of achieve critical mass on their own, which is going to be a huge challenge.
That's the thing though, is you don't need that. You can just have. So what I recommend for people to do is, if you can find a community that you like, that's interesting, you join it for the local timeline. So if there are 1,000 historians chatting in one instance, the nice part is you don't need to follow all of them. You have a local timeline now where they all live. So you can click one button and see all of what they're talking about, and then individually follow people on other places. So
but you don't know where they are.
Well, you have, there's a little bit of work you do, or you'll see them over time because they'll fly by. Invariably, they'll show up in your stream sooner or later. So the issue I have is I'll see people fly by and I'll be like, oh, I need to check because it's still new. Am I following them specifically? Have I followed them yet or not? And the fact that they went by reminds me of, I know I was following them on some other platform, with some other bird on it at one point, but I'm not sure if I am now.
Right.
And eventually it'll all settle down, but you have to do all that initial work you spent 16 years doing in Twitter.
Yeah.
To kind of redo that.
Chris, isn't it the case though that whoever administers a particular instance has some control over cross-instance sharing? I thought when you set one of these up, you could limit you could certain things like
block lists that you can turn off. So if you think of it in the sense that if Twitter could speak with Facebook, there's the original web, and on the original web, everything could potentially be seen or talked to by anything else. So Twitter and Facebook and Google Plus are all pieces of that federation, but the owners of Twitter and Facebook and Google Plus decided we're not going to federate with our competitors, so screw that.
Right.
And that same type of model is seen here. It's just that the people who are turning off other instances or your ability to see them are, and to a great extent, most of them are bot farms, spam instances, really crazy fringe Nazi, insane groups.
Right.
So as an example, Truth Social, and they got into some legal trouble because they didn't say as much and didn't credit it, but Truth Social is built on Mastodon and is just a kind of a reskinned version.
So
but
it's just a Mastodon server, basically.
So, but almost every instance in the Fediverse specifically turned off federation with that instance because for protection, we don't want to see it. Now, if you, I reasonably
the U.S. evidently scored.
I don't know if it blocks it completely, but if you want to see what Donald Trump is saying, I think you, on your own instance, even if they block it, can say, I want to follow it. And you and only you will see that, but none of the rest of the people on your server will. I haven't actually tried it, but I presume that's the case. So you can still see what other people are doing, but in a general sense, they can lock it off and turn off pieces of islands to say we're just for our emotional and mental safety, and Michigas. We're just not, we don't want to see any of that stuff. So we're going to flip a big switch and say no.
Yeah.
But if you want to still see pieces of it, you can.
Yeah. See,
So,
I don't like the model. I really don't like the idea that if I mean, I get what you're saying, Chris, about, I can tune into what 1,000 historians are saying on this thing and kind of see a timeline of it. I could do that on HNet already, but I never used HNet because I want to understand more than just that little element of their of what they're doing. I don't want to have, I don't want to have to go searching for, if, I don't know, Heather Cox Richardson, for example, who is she's a historian and a political commentator. I don't want to have to go and find, let's imagine she was also into, open educational resources, So how do I know unless I go and look for her and follow her on all of these different places, how do I know when Heather says something about history, when she says something about politics, when she says something about OER, right? Or or whatever, or when she posts pictures of Maine,
So I am probably one of the rare 1% exceptions who has accounts on multiple things and uses them. And most of the people who I've seen, and even me, if you look at the 8 different instances I have accounts on, or 4 or 5, however many it is right now, there's only 2 of them I'm really posting to at all. And so I haven't fragmented an identity across where I'm only saying PKM stuff on the PKM instance. And I'm saying all my history stuff is here. And, there's one called hcommons.social, which is the humanities commons group, which is a bunch of humanities people. And I'm not saying something different there. A few people maybe, but I think broadly most people have one account on one instance, and that's where they're putting everything. That may change over time, but the pattern I'm generally seeing, and I have seen since 2016 when all this started, is that most people typically have one account and one account only, and that's it.
Yeah. See, I mean, for me, I would, like my YouTube channel, right? I post things about PKM. I post things about history. I post things about. Those are the 2 main things. But I can go on Twitter and hashtag. Not that I do frequently hashtag Twitter storians because I don't dig those people who are part of that. But I could, right? I could say, I could go to Twitter. I noticed you are, when you post something to your own site, right? You notify like the Antinet, Reddit, and other, you put it out in other places that you've said something, right? So that they can go and find it. It does. And that's what I guess when I owned my own domains and, kind of had my own blogs, on my own, on my own servers and didn't use Substack or WordPress, that's what I used to do too. It seems like it's moving away from a global sort of availability and sharing model to another, to a once more, kind of atomized and siloed experience, which I don't think is a positive development. And also it's more, I've one of the reasons that I've sort of drifted away from Obsidian is because I don't want to be involved in the GitHub kind of community of coders, tweaking code and adding, and adding modules. And, I mean, and that's one of the things that I like a lot so far about Sprintle is like, it's a board, it's a card, there is some functionality. I mean, hopefully they will figure their business model out. I mean, that's another one of those they're going to come to a moment, between the alpha and the beta probably where, they're going to have to decide how they want to earn their living. But I like the fact that it's not, I mean, because I don't know, maybe it's an age thing. I don't feel that interested in, I mean, I'm sorry, but I used to write code. I used to be a Unix administrator. I don't want to do that anymore.
Yeah, no, I get it. And that's, I think, why a lot of people like Mastodon is they don't want to deal with the business of running and maintaining their own infrastructure and setup. And, it takes me a few minutes a week to like operate and maintain a website, but generally I'm posting to it and I have an easy ways of with clicking one button essentially and sending a post to like Reddit if I want.
Mm-hmm.
And it shows up there. And then I have a feed for my Reddits in a feed reader that I can skim through every now and then. But I don't have to go to Reddit regularly to see comments that people make because I have infrastructure set up that when I post something to Reddit, if you reply to it, within 10 or 20 minutes, I'm going to get a ping back to my website as a comment.
Right.
And my website will give me that notification that you commented and I can see it and respond or do whatever I need to. But I don't have to have.
Does your website then aggregate those comments from different sources?
Yeah. So
that's cool.
If I post something on it and I send it to Mastodon and Twitter and Reddit, and there's probably 3 others that do that, and you reply on one of those platforms, the reply comes back to me and I can show it as a comment, which I do the majority of the time, although not always.
That's what I thought. Yeah, looking at your comments.
And so if you see something and you'll see 3 comments on Reddit, if you click through and go to my site, you may see 20 more comments because it went other places.
Right.
And you'll see all of it to have a better context. Now, you may not have, there may be some missing context between the people who are commenting on Reddit not seeing the comments from other places. And that's their loss, maybe, because they chose to only use Reddit. But
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because there is kind of an analogy to the way these tools are built, right? Like Scrintle, all of the cards exist everywhere, but but you can create a board that has just some of them, and so the boards seem to be analogous to these servers in Mastodon, for example, where I've got the information and I've got the links to that the cards link perhaps to other information elsewhere in the main database, right? But and I can see the links, right? And I can and if I click on the link, it takes it opens it opens a view of that card, right? But it doesn't put it on the board unless I ask it to. Right, so I can think about what is it that I want to work with right now, and that I do find that useful, right? And I've been sort of thinking about it's kind of weird because I mean there seems to be, and I guess we'll be talking about this a lot as we kind of talk about Scott's ideas about paper note taking. What you've called sort of, Chris, what you've called the affordances of these different tools, right? And so and the question of sort of will we be guided by or channeled by or determined by the capabilities of the applications, or or is there an application that that kind of matches the way we're already thinking. And I think Pat, that's been one of my points of resistance with the brain, right? Is that I'm not really a mind map guy, because and I think maybe part of it is because I think that there ought to be. I've always thought mind maps are too random. It's like, well, it's just random. Whether this thing connects to this thing over here, or whether the other thing should be down here, or and there's no and that strikes me somehow as, I don't know, too much chaos, not enough order, or something like that.
Yeah, or the issue of context collapse, which is the opposite of what you've described on Sprintle. So you generally know what's there in the space, but you can focus in on a specific board to narrow your focus.
Mm-hmm.
But you internally have a conceptualization of what's on that bigger board, whether it's the specifics or broad generalities. You can see it and then choose to focus down on something smaller, versus the opposite issue in most social media is you're seeing a stream of things go by. You can focus on the one thing you're looking at, and you may have bits of context for what the slightly bigger board looks like. But if it's someone you don't know well, someone who's relatively new or completely new to you, you're missing the entirety of their context of what they've said and thought before.
Mm-hmm.
And the only thing you're presented with is that one thing, which you may have some thought or reply to, but how your reply looks, and particularly to them, not knowing that you have no idea of the rest of their context. You may reply to somebody and they have a PhD in the area. They've studied it for 50 years.
Right.
And they know way more than you're ever gonna. You're stuck, and they'll think you're a freaking idiot when you respond to that, because you don't have that bigger context. I actually got into trouble once with an academic, and I made it. It was really more an annotation for me, but I did it during the holidays when I wasn't at my office setup, and I did it in such a way that, and I totally forgot how my home setup differed from my office setup. So I made an annotation for me to follow up after the holidays when I got back to the office, and I said something that was a comment. And it wasn't even for me, but it was for another person who was doing some research who had no idea what the area was. So I made a very basic statement like, oh, you should read this book as it relates to this topic. And it accidentally syndicated to Twitter that copy instead of keeping it for me, which my office system did. And it actually sent it to her. And she's like, you fucking knucklehead reply guy. Pardon my language, but she's like, it was like one of the first books I ever read. Why are you like, I'm a professional, I think it was a medieval thing. I'm a medievalist, like, idiot reply guy. And was like, and I had to apologize and say, it was a system error, and it was meant for a student who definitely has not read this book and should. My comment has nothing to do with anything in your world.
Yeah.
But she had no idea that that's what my reply was about. And I don't think about it when I annotate things on hypothesis too much, because mostly I'm doing it for me. There's a few people who read it, and occasionally I may annotate things with super obvious observations. And the times that I do that, it's not obvious that I'm doing it not for me, but for one or two of the people who I know who are following my hypothesis feeds, who may learn something or find a link to go somewhere to get some other context for them.
Right.
But I don't write that out explicitly, and it's just there. And it's not me replying to. I guess the nice part is those kind of annotations are a layer of context that's added without the necessary social aspect of, I'm not commenting on what the author's saying here. Here's just some extra context I've laid down for whoever may stumble across it next, who may not see it the same way I do, or may not have the same context that I come to it with. So there, that kind of context collapse is kind of pulled apart because of the social aspect of what that tool is. Whereas if I took all of my annotations and fed them into Twitter, I think I would get into a lot of trouble, because people would think, oh, this guy is replying to me specifically.
Right.
And that's a whole different social context in and of itself.
Yeah. I mean, it does help.
But the one of the things, particularly since we started off way back with our first and particularly second book, obviously Chris is published on the net quite widely through Hypothesis, amongst other things. And aside from using, say, Reddit as social media as opposed to Twitter or Facebook, what I have noticed is those relatively well-written and well-focused newsletters that allow you to comment, and they've got 10,000 plus supposedly subscribers, have got so few comments. It's unbelievable. As in, you may or may not have paid for this newsletter, and we all know in that context, in a classroom type situation or a seminar or a workshop, you get out what you put in. And it's one of the things I've liked with some of those making history things is you're showing, this is how I do it, but this is why I do it this way, because that's the tech at the time, which in part is why I asked about Zotero half an hour ago. And there seems to be an awful lot of one voice, in effect, out there, but so little second, third, and fourth voices, until you then come across something like this, where the forum tends to now be speech, so we're not restricted to how fast you type.
Yeah.
Right. And that annoys me with some of the message services. Like even something like WhatsApp, it's a message service, so I'll answer it when I get back to it. It's not a telephone conversation. It doesn't ping pong. It does sometimes, but it's not always like that. I might be walking, I might be going to the toilet, I might have left the phone by the desk or whatever.
Right.
Whereas we're here now, and it's exact, in all intents and purposes, it's as if we are in the same room.
Yes. Well, and we're focused on the same thing at the same time.
Absolutely.
Right? And that's one of the things that, that I was thinking, when Chris was describing, hypothesis. I mean, there have been times, there have been these social annotation experiments, like the big one that they did, when they read the Doug Engelbart article, right? And everybody knew what the point was, and so they had kind of built a community. It wasn't just somebody finding this thing on. I used to do that all the time. What you do, Chris? I used to just in public do my annotations on anything that I found on the on the web, just thinking, well, okay, maybe somebody will see this someday, maybe they won't. Now actually I've got a private group of my own that I just call research, where some of the things I just I keep for myself.
That's part of the open garage thing I was going to ask, is partly because of elements of the toxic Twitter come Facebook type stuff. Even if I wanted to be public and as an element of interface with, say, Chris more on hypothesis, say, there would be times when I would want to be working in inverted commas, concentrating on the work rather than the discussion so much. So you do a chunk and then you release it in a chunk as though almost like sort of, if I remember rightly, Andy Weir wrote The Martian originally chapter by chapter and got feedback chapter by chapter. So he was altering it backwards as well as making sure he didn't make the same mistake forwards. And then he ended up with people saying, it's too much hassle to read all these HMTL files. Can you make it one PDF? Or how do I load a PDF and all the rest of it? I mean, it became a book. And then it became, And so, and I must admit, it's been, Chris, I think, mentioned last time or the time before about the fact that some of his pages have got a big spike in a hit. Some of that's me, I'm sure, because I've sort of been wandering around and saying, yeah, okay, so some of it is clearly slightly different versions of what we were talking about, particularly with Sonka's book. Others are a bit more in, the dawn of everything.
Yeah.
But it then goes backwards into that because as he said a moment ago, you don't know whether you're talking to a 50-year plus PhD or some kid who's got his mum's account open
right
at the age of 8 and has managed to type a few semi-sensible words.
Yeah. The internet,
and particularly and things like when I started work, for instance, there was no AutoCAD, so we still drew by hand, right? And it just started as I started almost, and then when I went to university a couple of years later, because I decided to go to work first. They'd got it down to the fact they could draw, but they couldn't connect it to the calculation. Now they do it all in one go. And when I was at uni, we had a conference, but we all us as students were obviously, you're a student of the university, you're allowed to go to a conference for free. And the biggest thing then was to have the lighting calculation linked to the rendering program, so that the rendering program would be able to do the light going through the building. We could do one light source, i.e. the sun, do the daylight. And it was a case of now we need the extra computing power to do multiple light sources of multiple strengths, of multiple colors, because we're doing it in color as opposed to, hey guys, I'm only drawing in black and white, because that's what engineering type drawings were. And that was like knocking 40 years ago. So now I'm seeing what you and Chris particularly are, and a couple of the others on the first couple of books were doing in terms of education-wise or educational style software. And it's like, research rabbit? What the hell? It's like, I don't need to go to the stacks anymore. I've got, science citation hardback books on my laptop, in effect, albeit a Wi-Fi connection. And it's like, how would you go? How would we teach the skills to make sure that 50 years after the collapse that's coming, as it were, we're not all playing tribal wars with stone, bows and arrows.
Right.
We can leapfrog. I mean, there's elements of leapfrogging, mostly because you can do it. Like, most of the African countries still haven't built a telephone system because you don't need to. Just put a mobile tower up.
Right.
You've got a telephone system. You don't need a cable,
Right.
right? And even most of rural Spain is like that because they never got to it for whatever reason.
Yeah. When I first went to college, I wanted to be either an architect or a landscape architect, and I failed because I couldn't draw. And I couldn't get and I had this guy in my drafting class. The professor was like an artist. So he was all over line weights, and I just could not get my line weights right. And so I bombed out. So that was the end of so I mean, that's a perfect example of, a technology that has sort of replaced that, right? If I were starting again now, I might end up doing that. Right?
Yeah, you'd be relatively fine.
Yeah.
Likewise, when I'm in a meeting and it's a relatively small one, so we're using a whiteboard, I'm always getting a comment, how comes your handwriting is so neat? It's because I did this on drawings for the best part of 10 years.
Yeah.
Right? Oh. And I got taught at school at the age of 11. I started engineering drawing at the age of 11. So it's not like it was new even when I went to work. But I'm in part of all this AI coming through, and as I mentioned in passing in the chat, I can see it as irrespective of how fast it really does what it does. I mean, I laughed. I did a Google search today, and I got literally one result. And I thought, hell, that's been a long time since I've had one result.
Yeah, how did that happen?
But what it turned out was I thought it was a quote, and what it was somebody paraphrasing. So of course, only they paraphrased exactly. Right. Those right, and it looked like a quote, and I thought that looks like a quote, and so who said that? Because I know this person's just copying the quote, and it was paraphrased, and it's and as I say, back in my high school days, I worked in my public library, so things like we've spoken about your numbering system. And a couple of the other people are using the Congress library numbering system
for topics.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So I don't know that because not being an American. So, but I use the Dewey Decimal number. So I know, and even now, it's over 40 years since I've done that. I still know those numbers because I still use libraries. Yeah. And there's elements of what useless skills come back. And you said about things like you don't get mind maps, and I've always in our conversations said I don't like the notes interface in the graph, particularly once it gets above like 30 or 50. There's no way, just with a color scheme, that you really get any tangible information out of it, other than, oh shit, I've got 90% blue dots or whatever.
Well, that was one of the things that I objected to on the graph too. And now I'm really, now it's 3-dimensional too, right? There's a plugin you can make your graph 3D. It's that'll be even more random.
But and you also got these people that have, because they've got atomic note base as well, a 10-minute read as a newsletter is probably 25, 30 different notes, and it's clearly on the same subject, right? So there's this little cluster, like fish eggs all stuck together, somewhere inside this 3,000 plus dotting picture, which may or may not be 3-dimensional. And it's like the link that I put in the chat, in the community note from the guy that was talking to Tim Ferriss, Wolferson.
Oh, yeah. Stephen Wolfram,
Yeah, Stephen Wolfram. 2 or 3 newsletters ago, he announced that the Wolfram language is a mathematical assistance to Mathematica and does presentations, has gone literally 3D model from the Obsidian one. And the journey through that, I can see of a walkthrough that describes can be useful, so you can retrace either your own steps or somebody could follow your path and therefore in theory realize that you've read things maybe in the wrong sequence. Therefore you come out with maybe a biased opinion on something. But that presumes a lot of effort for somebody else's thinking, although you could retrace it. But it also presumes that people are willing to go to that level of interaction. And the way you see it on normal social media, that's not what happens, right? And I do the same. I'll put my hand up. I've got one real big bugbear with one particular institution, and almost every time that institution gets mentioned, I'm in there with should be bankrupted or should be brought to a halt or assets should be distributed or whatever. And the power to find that conversation, to say, yes, I've got a grump on, so I don't care. I'm going to go through everybody on Facebook that mentions the word Quintet or something or whatever, or the Carlisle group or whoever, right? And rant and rave in their little woodwork area or whatever it happens to be, is so stupidly powerful that you then wonder, well, let's turn that completely around and say, what's the benefit? What's the useful thing to do? And I still can't see a really good use for 1,000+ bubble diagram, bubble gum even, you know. And but I don't think I'm as linear as a text. And I don't have them anymore for a whole bunch of reasons. But I can remember taking it back to going back to the stacks with the citation index and stuff. I know one paper. Who did he quote or she quote?
Yes.
That's easy because you got the paper. But who quoted them?
Right.
And
depending on how wealthy your library is, JSTOR can do that. It's just that most people don't pay for that in their subscription.
Yeah, but I mean, fortunately, the university I went to was big enough, moneyed enough that pretty much everything within our subject area was there. And although it's a more science engineering based university, virtually all of the books on the shelves were, this is the history of Japanese art, and this is, completely, there was no history of art, history of architecture, but no history of art, right? As such. And the guys and girls doing the maths had relatively few textbooks that they didn't have of their own copy, sort of thing. But there's all the papers, right? Which was obviously at university levels much more important.
Yeah.
And it's I can see that I was blown away with hypothesis because I didn't even know it existed.
Yeah.
But I'm still looking for, I think, something that actually writes a bit more from an outline structure.
Uh-huh.
And I don't think even the outline plugins to date work very well. But oddly enough, the people that did Obsidian do Dynalist, and Dynalist is great for outlines. But at the moment, they don't automatically
They don't talk to each other. Yeah.
don't talk.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of funny because I've been very hopeful that Skrintl will do that for me. And I had sort of created this on one of my research topics, the sort of the free thinkers, right? I had created this board that was just a bunch of things connected to each other. And actually I went back to it and, just this week, and I thought, this isn't working for me. I've got to put this I've got to do something with this. I've got to organize it along some type of a dimension. And I decided to do a timeline because, I'm a historian, so I like timelines. but and at least the timeline gives me, some type of kind of superstructure to, to arrange it. And I do think that is helpful, and or necessary. I really loved, I liked it just from an ego perspective, that I had this bubble, it's like what Chris is saying, the bubble graph boys. I was a bubble graph boy for a while, and I liked my bubbles, and I liked that, and I liked that I could drag them around and they would bounce around and stuff. And then, and actually somebody just, on one of my videos, somebody just commented on a video that I made and said, you could use the local graph. And I was like, yeah, I get that. The local graph in Obsidian is more useful than the main graph. But even so, and I do actually like the fact that you can toggle the degrees of separate, or the degrees of connectedness, right? You can go to 1 link, 2 links, 3 links kind of thing, and and it explodes into something that actually 3 links becomes less interesting.
I see that where people have used tags a lot. So how many notes have you got that have got one tag?
Mm-hmm.
And by quirk of fate, there was quite there's a newsletter webpage that seems to be about 10 different people collectively doing stuff, and they've stopped doing blogs, but they still do newsletter.
Mm-hmm.
And they had a whole page. Here's all of our tags, and I thought, that'd be just have a quick look. We got 11,000 tags.
Well, it's like Chris, yeah.
Most of them with one note.
Well, Chris got more than that.
Yeah. I mean, I resent that remark. I think right now I'm hovering somewhere around just north of 10,000 tags on my website. But what's interesting is that after doing it over a while, you start to see things you're interested in emerge. And so usually somewhere north of any time I've used a tag more than 100 times or 150 somewhere, I have some threshold I've written down. I'll turn that tag into a category to say kind of like, I've written more about this thing as a thing, and it's easier to find.
Yeah.
But it's also, and some of this goes back to, there's an affordance that physical libraries and physical books and physical stacks have that we've lost in a digital space.
Mm-hmm.
And occasionally I will go to physical libraries to re-experience it, especially research libraries, is you go for that one book and you look it up in a digital catalog. And, during the pandemic, I got into, and I noticed I missed it more too during the pandemic, when you order the book and somebody picks it off the shelf for you and puts it in a bag, or they ship it to you directly. So you miss that piece of the experience. But even if you look it up in a digital catalog, you go to the shelf and you not only see that book, but then you see not only the books around it that are similar in topic, but things that are a couple shelves above, a couple shelves below, and maybe you turn around and you see something catches your eye on the shelf behind you, which is totally unrelated, but somehow might be tangentially related and a serendipitous find.
Yeah.
And that's hard to recreate, even in a space like Amazon can take massive amounts of data. And when I buy, a new detective novel, they'll be able to say people who picked this also picked these 3 other things.
Right.
And I might get a tiny hint of that type of serendipity from that algorithm. But usually it's not very good and it's not great. And it also is watered down by the reversion to the mean of the masses who are into this stuff.
Right.
And it's one of the things that I kind of enjoy in the graph stuff in Obsidian and other tools. Even like a small local graph doesn't do a great job of it. I go look for an idea and I find it, and I don't see the things physically around it, or I don't pay attention, or I need to make the time and effort to pay attention to that. Versus if it's in my paper card index, while I'm looking for it, I'm thumbing past things that are around it. And the things that are around it, because of the design of the way I file them, automatically puts related ideas nearby. So I'll see them and have that review, or I was looking for something, but I found this other thing. And right now, to me, that other thing's actually more interesting than the thing I was actually looking for.
Right.
And then you can go off on those tangents, and we totally miss, I think, in a lot of those digital realms, both for book searches, digital book searches, and digital idea finding. In fact, but now when I go and look for things, usually if I'm looking for a specific book, I almost never look for the book title. I will specifically, if I know the author, I'll specifically look for the author, because they'll have written 5 other books in and around that subject. And I know I want to see what those are too. So I've started to train myself to look for the author rather than the title. Because if I look for the title, that's all I'm going to find. But if I look for the author or the co-authors, other authors, I'm way more likely to see other things tangential to what I'm looking for to give me that serendipity.
Yeah.
And it's hard to cognizantly do that, or to build in how can I find more serendipity in my searches. And I don't see a lot of people talking about that at all.
Yeah.
And
I had that experience this week. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Didn't mean to.
No.
Well, the experience that I had this week was I was reading this book that turned out to be not at all what I hoped it was going to be, but it had a bunch of really interesting citations, right? So I started mining the footnotes and the bibliography, and I would go, so I was reading it on Kindle, and then I would go to my library page, and they basically pass through WorldCat, but with a wrapper around it, so that if the book happens to be available in my library, they have this little app that will give you a digital version of a snapshot of the books around it, the books to the left, the books to the right on the shelf, based on the numbering system. And I did actually, I was expecting that I was gonna request this book by interlibrary loan, but it turned out they had it. And then I thought, well, okay, I'll still press the button to have them get it off the shelf for me and bring it down to the circulation desk. But when I go and pick it up, I am going to walk back up to the stacks with it and look at those books on either side, because they did, they looked as interesting or more interesting than the one that I was asking for. And I do think that's a really, and there is, the other thing that I was thinking as I was kind of going through this process is this guy, this scholar, I mean, I hate him, but I love the research that he did. Because he was like over the top, kind of postmodernist lit and theology kind of weird combination that I was just very uncomfortable with. But some of the stuff, and he's talking about the 19th century in America, and he's talking about Melville, and he's talking about all of these things, and he brought up some of these, some books that I had never heard of that I found on on archive.org. And, and so now I've sort of got this collection that sort of recreates him, but then I'm following it into a different direction. And so, yeah, so all of our little worlds of research and notes and resources, are going to diverge, right? And are going to follow our interest, from one link to another. And that's, I think, one of the things that Mike and the Research Rabbit guys were hoping to do with this publish your collection thing, was because all of the link, I mean, even if we're just using all of the links that they provide, right, we're still choosing them based on our own interests. So there's a curation, happening again and again and again as we kind of press that, find the links to, find the related articles to this, find the related articles to this, and we've chosen, a specific set of articles out of the things that return to us. And so we're sort of we're digging our own rabbit hole to kind of go down. So yeah, I think making that kind of thing public is interesting. But then on the other hand, Tim, it's like you said, I mean, there are so many things. There are a lot of people just, kind of crying in the wilderness, right? There are a lot of people putting stuff up on the web and getting one response, maybe, or getting one, and when you think about it, it's got to be, 1,000 to 1, 10,000 to 1, the actual engagement rate. I mean, the beauty, I guess, of having the entire world connected to the web is that, everybody can find their people out there, but, how many do you have to sift through to collect the ones
Yeah.
that are going, I mean, it's like this group here, right?
I'm curious if there's a name for that library program or functionality that will show you what's on the shelves next to. Is there a name for it, or is it just some random thing that's built into the system that doesn't have a?
I don't know. Let me look.
I mean, that would be really cool if that were like a standalone program and you could run it on anything or use it in other spaces.
I don't think it's a function of WorldCat. I think it is probably, I think it's probably the thing that we've built around WorldCat. But let me double check that. Research and support catalogs. I think it's in an app that we subscribe to called First Search. And it's taking me some time to look.
Is it continually updated?
Yeah, I believe it is. Yeah, and some of them have images, like, so there is kind of like a graphical thing, and some of them, but I think it just pulls them out of the cloud. Let me try to,
because that kind of thing also pops up in both Google Books kind of does it, and the Internet Archive book section does that. You'll search for something, and then at the bottom they'll show you kind of similar titles, or titles by the same author. That's kind of useful, but that kind of stuff is not centered, and unless you kind of actively go look for it. And for me, that's the thing, is I wish more platforms would kind of actively center that kind of thing to draw your attention to those, rather than you having to spend the emotional labor and intellectual labor to actually dig for them. But it's kind of like, when you were talking about search and serendipity, you can be subscribed to, 4,000 or 5,000 people on Twitter and scroll your feed, and your emotional response, even if the thing you're reading right now isn't great, the next thing or two things later will be interesting, or interesting enough that your reward center in your brain will be like, oh, this is great. And then you could spend all day scrolling, but the amount of insight you're likely to find in those types of feeds is, almost non-existent.
So this is
versus going down your own rabbit holes.
So you pick something and it shows what's around it.
So so this book was on the shelf, right? So
Right.
and it tells me that it's available, and then it says, and then these are the books around it on the shelf.
Wow. That's
That oddly enough is still very linear, very shelf-like.
Yes.
as
Yeah, and I've
opposed
never
to-
tried. I've never just kept going. I guess there is a limit. I just found the limit on the right.
as opposed to having at least the mind map type. Here is the
Right.
original book,
Mhm.
whatever book you want to pick.
Yeah.
One set of citations, two sets of citations, and
Right,
like
and that's
research-
right, and
like
that's the thing that
Research Rabbit.
Research Rabbit is trying to do. I think, yeah.
yeah.
And then
But it's like-
then it's interacting with us, and we're curating the ones that we choose, and then looking for their additional,
But
links.
of course, they say both the transmission of information, but in their ability to pick it from all the databases and then give it back is such that you get 50 bubbles maximum. And in some respects, there's that it's hands rolling. The guy who did all the work on
Rosling, yeah,
pandemics.
yeah, Hans Rosling, yeah,
Hands rolling.
the bubble.
As
He
far as
did
I'm-
the bubbles.
Yes, yeah. I was going to say, as far as I'm concerned, he's the only guy that should be doing bubbles because he did it really, really well.
Yep.
Really, and more importantly, from an engineering point of view, it's got scales with numbers on. It's not just a shape. you know?
Right. Well, and that's the thing, and that's why I went back to the timeline, right? Because I need some type of organizing.
Yes.
principle. Yeah.
Yeah, but I also know that I have effectively a kleptomania in terms of I can click and capture stuff or clip out stuff faster than I can really, as a minimum, process it, such that that's an interesting link.
Right.
I've read the abstract or I've read the intro paragraph. Yes, I want that. So I capture it with its URL as a minimum, and I know I captured it today.
Kleptomania, that is great.
Right?
Yeah.
Right? That's it. If I now then start to put in tags or whatever, that's more. But I often find that I don't do that because I want to go to the next one.
Oh, that's
Such that I then only put tags in when I pick it up again to say, no, I'm going to use it. And I had a quick part of the reason why I've been absent in eyeball contact for the last few minutes is I had a quick look at what was my most tagged item. And I excluded authors because if I've got a thing about the Amazon page for an author, or Goodreads page for the author, or whatever, then I tag that and each book. And some people have got 50 books, so that's 50 tags.
That's my fear of the brain.
Yeah, I just leave those alone. I'm minded to say that I want a folder in Obsidian terms or a notebook in Evernote terms as soon as my tags go above a number, 100, 250 or something, because it's clearly a big enough wodge of stuff that needs to be semi-organized, because at least search still goes across folders and notebooks,
right?
As opposed to going in Obsidian terms across vaults. The search stops within the vault.
Yeah.
And although there was some discussion about why would you have multiple vaults, we're using one as in it controls the publication stroke access.
Yeah. Well, and actually that's one of the things that I do like about Obsidian is that the Readwise sweeps into Obsidian. I can search all of those.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's
Do the same in Evernote.
That's the fear that I had of the brain. Actually, my other, aside from not just not liking mind maps, the other fear was that, because it has so many hooks to drag so much information into it, that it would get ahead of me, and it would not be mine in the sense that I had not thought about it. I had not processed it. It was just, and I guess, that kind of echoes, what Graeber and Wengrow were talking about, the library of Umberto Eco, right? All of these 30,000 books that he hasn't read, being the kind of the meaningful thing. But I want more control. I want the things that I'm responding to be things that I've actually responded to, had a thought about, and had some type of at least preliminary inkling of how they fit into a bigger.
In parts, adding to the information overload that Chris is asking about. As he said, if you've got a pile of cards, you know that that's a pile of cards, and it's the biggest pile I've got. The other thing that I find, particularly say coming from Evernote as the original note taker that I used, if I do a search and out of the 30,000 plus notes, I get 3,000 responses, then I know I've got a tangible, sizable chunk. If I get, as I said earlier at dinner, I've got a 1 result from Google this week, then it's not a significant thing to be necessarily dealt with, organized around, or for. And of course, periodically, particularly if you're using search on a regular basis, then you must be getting some idea of how many responses you get, such that you get a feeling for what do you need to put this in its own wrapper, container, whatever you want to call it. The thing that I found disappointing initially, and I don't know whether it's been corrected yet with Research Rabbit, is you can search within a collection, but you couldn't search between collections. And because the collections initially, at least to me, came over very much like Zotero collections, because they use the same word. Zotero has this big bucket of all your PDFs,
right?
And when you make a collection, it's just metadata. So I can search the bucket, but I get answers per collection. Research Rabbit didn't do that to start with. And so I know that there are a number of instances where I put the same paper in by accident in 2 collections in Research Rabbit, which annoys me somewhat because I like the Zotero structure such that there is a copy. So when I pick it up from collection 1, and then I also have it collection 2 and pick it up again to do some more comments. Okay, I've got yellow comments. Let's put some blue ones in because it's a different project. And then you've got elements for your timeline, etc. And one of the questions I was going to ask us, I used to use way back when, literally Notepad to do like a day note under Windows. And the one thing that Notepad had back then that almost nothing else had was literally, if you started the paragraph with F3, you got a date timestamp automatically. So every time you started a paragraph or you started a new note about what was going on at work, because that's how I used it to do a project diary page. And then at the end of the day, I cut and paste that into a Word document because nobody used Notepad to do any real formatting.
Right.
Because word wrap or no word wrap, that was about it back then.
Yeah.
But this timestamp was really, really useful. anybody, is there, I had a quick run through the other day, but not particularly focused on it. Is there something similar in Obsidian? Because there isn't in Evernote, which
there's
annoys me.
there's a daily note. There's a daily note.
Yeah, I know there's daily notes, but
Yeah.
is there something that I can timestamp each paragraph?
No,
automatically?
but not automatically. But you can make a God, what do they call them in Obsidian? A macro basically that will make that.
So I could create,
Yeah.
say F3
Yeah.
does this.
Yeah.
Through a template, presumably.
A template. Yeah, that was the word I was
So
looking
it's going to be inside a template,
Yep.
either as itself or part of a bigger template that does the daily note.
Yep. And then
Okay, I shall have to look at it from that point of view.
yeah. Well, it looks like we have used our time. Pat, I would like to hear about Scott's. Maybe when we start up next week, we can talk about kind of your thoughts about Scott's approach with with a digital kind of a back end like the Brain or Obsidian.
Have we got a date? Have we got a date for Scott to join us? Because that was one of the things you said.
We don't
originally.
We don't yet, because he said he wasn't going to be available until after like mid-December. So we're not going to. Yeah, I was originally hoping that we could start with him and then continue once we have the book, but that's not going to work out.
No, okay. So he's going to be, if he comes at all, he's going to come up in the middle.
Or at the end, maybe we'll wait and kind of go through it and then have him
Q&A at the end.
kind of do a Q&A.
Once we've assembled all the arguments against it.
Exactly. And hopefully it won't just be that. Hopefully we'll have some points of agreement too.
He might wonder what the hell he's walked into.
Yes. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
but yeah,
Okay.
we should. And he says he's launching, and I assume the launch means that the actual for sale Kindle version will be available on at 11 o'clock California time on the 9th as well. So
I'm also sorry to have to report, but you guys are now out of the World Cup. Holland beat you.
oh,
Was it
The first
2-1?
knockout. It's just finished.
2-1?
It's still a win. It was 3-1.
No, I know. It was the score 2-1.
Yeah. Yeah, 3-1.
3-1. Okay.
okay.
And those
So much
of
for-
any
so much
with
for
a
that thing on
Canadian
TV.
extraction, this World Cup is the first World Cup Canada's actually scored a goal. In two different matches, but they're out anyway.
Yeah, we can start with the digital version that he donated, but then hopefully other people who come on will also, because I imagine that if he's having them shipped from some printer in Michigan, people who buy the physical book are not going to have it, buy it on Friday, have it on Saturday, kind of thing. So hopefully that full on Kindle version will be available for download to people who buy it on Friday, and they can kind of start. And then at least the rest of us who have the pre-release copy will have something to say about the first 100 pages.
Yeah, Patrick, I'm interested in your digital implementation too, partly because it assumes you've identified the critical features that the author thinks differentiate the kind of physical notes from the digital notes, and
Mhm.
why if you can to implement an equally effective digital version assumes you can identify the parameters that are missing and have found a way to add them.
Yeah, well, you can go through my notes that I've posted, 2 of them in the new Antinet Book Club.
Yeah.
But I have to admit that the thing that I can't duplicate is the benefits of handwriting something on a note card. But I'm willing to forego that for the other advantages I get with a digital system.
Well, and especially having a database as big as you do, just using what Scott's doing, to index that and organize things for output. Again, that was my original objection, or my problem with Obsidian, in the summertime was, the path to output. So yeah, so I think that's going to be really useful. And I'll read your responses before we meet again on Saturday.
Because it's interesting. There's a whole literature, an experimental literature on aspects of this. So there's a literature on comparing comprehension, reading comprehension in digital versus paper. There's another literature that looks at classroom note taking and what happens, groups being compared on taking notes by hand and on a device.
Right.
When you get to this kind of realm, doing a true experiment would be very difficult. So we're just kind of guessing to some extent, I think. I mean, this is my impression.
Mm-hmm.
We're kind of guessing on what would actually differentiate the systems, the approaches.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, you can't test it like you can test
Well,
is comprehension the same.
I propose
note taking effectiveness the same.
I propose a face-off between Scott's card stack and my digital stack.
All right.
There you go.
All right. Maybe that. Okay. We'll try to figure out how to make that the thing that happens when he comes to visit us.
Cage match.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool.
One of the things that kind of kills me is, in watching some of these debates, is most of the studies I've seen on these digital typing versus analog writing, that the number, the N for these research studies is usually incredibly low.
Yeah.
And almost none of them talk about the idea of neurodiversity and how different people think. So they don't,
it's hard enough just getting 50 people in a group.
Yeah. I would love to see a study where they would have people differentiated on a neurodiversity spectrum from, the autistic-y and then the Asperger-y and then some normies in the middle and some, there aren't even names really for the people at the other end of the spectrum. Maybe dyslexics.
Yeah. Well, and maybe also people who can't type well.
Low IQ in general, or even on an IQ spectrum.
Yeah.
And then do those studies with at least an N of 50 to 100 in each group.
Right.
And then see what that looks like. Because I think that we're totally missing that piece of the puzzle.
Yeah. And people who can't type, because Sonke Aaron's made these points too about how, you type so fast, that you can type every word. And I certainly can't. Right. So that would be a different experience. Yeah, I think there's a lot. And also the people who are, there have been so few. There needs to be a meta-analysis of all of these studies too, because, so many of the people, there are so few studies done that so many of the people who have been doing them have been seeking that result. Right. And so that sort of bias.
Well, I think academics want to know, they want to make a simple, maybe that's the problem.
Yeah.
They want to assign a digital version, is that justified? And
yeah.
And even then, most of these studies usually are heavily biased based on the sample they're getting. So if you're doing a study on this, you're doing a study on college students who already are a separate category. Or I think there was another one that they did at a TED Talk. And the people who are going to show up for a TED Talk are going to be very specific, and not only show up, but show up in person at a TED Talk.
Yeah.
So the bias in some of these is just so ridiculous from the get-go versus,
just based on
what does this
if
look
you try to pull these things together, that's the problem I have. Because, the notion of a personal note-taking process and system is very different than the skills of taking notes in a class where you're not particularly interested in the topic, but you got to get a good score on the exam. The fact that you're taking notes doesn't mean there's a whole different range of circumstances in which taking notes can be applied. And this whole idea of, a lifelong commitment to learning through note taking, if that's what you guys what we're talking about, is that anywhere close to the challenges of, I mean, it obviously isn't. So,
Right.
and just finding answers, and especially to big questions I mean, this is a big question because it's going to require a commitment of hundreds and thousands of hours.
Yeah.
The other thing I
I
see
mean, that's what's
missing
kind of
too,
interesting about it, I think.
the other piece that's missing too that always makes it interesting, and a lot of the huge interest in the broader area by people like us or people who subscribe to some of these subreddits, is I know what my practice is. What are other people doing, and how is what they're doing possibly better than what I'm doing, that I could learn something from them to make my process better.
Right.
And I'm unaware of, although I'm starting to slowly compile it after looking at it a while, is what are the kind of broad general rules and general practices that people have had. And so here's a smorgasbord of practices and rules and things, along with explanations of why you might want to do those things. What affordances does that allow? So that you as an individual can come to it and look at the panoply of options and then say, for me and for the way I learn, the way I think, the way I want to operate, I want to do this, this, and this.
Right.
To get those affordances for myself. And then the other issue is that things you choose within that group may have second and third order effects that you're not aware of in year month 1 or 2 or even year 1 or 2, but you may see emergent properties 3 or 4 years out that you would never have expected to see.
Right.
And there's not enough people who've been doing this long enough and talking about it, and talking about, the interesting thing I think about Luhmann is he at least had done it for decades and then spoke and talked about a few of the emergent things that he saw.
Right.
But he didn't do it at an incredibly deep level. And when he did, I think most people who read those bits of material he wrote totally miss it. It goes over their heads and they don't think about it. They don't care. Or they look at it and be like, there's no way I'm going to do this for 40 years or even 10 years to see those emergent properties. So I'm really not going to care.
Right.
But that literature just doesn't exist, at least to my knowledge.
Right.
And I want to bring it into existence, but if others have ideas about things they've seen along that spectrum, I would love to hear about them.
Okay. And on that note.
Oh yeah, we gotta go. Somebody's got errands to run.
So thanks. I will I'll post this and then I will read what Pat put in the vault and the first 100 pages of Scott, and see you next week. All right.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks a lot. See you.